Okay, so welcome to another supporters evening, and like I say, we've got some First World War images to have a look at, which I'm just going to get up onto the screen now. So, what I thought we'd do is have a look at some postcards connected with. Hang on a minute, I can just hear a little bit of background noise. Bear with me. Okay. We're going to have a look at some images connected with cemeteries of the Great War. Cemetery postcards, we're kind of loosely calling this. This is something that's interested me for a long time, as kind of almost since the very beginning of kind of picking up stroke collecting postcards. I was astonished to go to, I remember Brighton Market in the good old days in Sussex when you could go down to places and find all this incredible Great War material. I remember going out to the Sussex market, the Brighton Market in Sussex, and one of the dealers having a load of postcards on his stand of Ypres, cloth all in ruins and so on, and then some kind of pictures of cemeteries with wooden crosses. And I was absolutely astonished to kind of see these kind of things, not realizing that those images existed. So I began to look out for them because obviously, as we can see with this first one, which is Lijssenthoek Cemetery, they kind of offer a slightly different view of what we know of the cemeteries that we may have visited during the course of our journeys along the old front line. So what I'm going to do, we're not going to cover every cemetery, you'll be pleased to know. We're going to look at a few selected images, roughly kind of going from north to south, from Flanders down to the Somme, with a little bit of to-ing and fro-ing, and just to get an idea of the kind of postcards that were produced. So okay, so we're going to start with a few from a little set that was made of Lijssenthoek Cemetery itself. So that one that was on the kind of intro card was actually a real photographic image, probably taken from the roof of a car, because it's got quite a bit of height behind it. And in my experience of trying to research these photographers, they often had kind of box cars with a solid roof that they could clamber up the side of and set their camera up on a tripod on the roof to get some perspective. Would you be using drones these days, or selfie sticks, or something like that to try and get that kind of perspective? They had to physically climb up on top of a large car to do it. So that's one kind of image. These are produced by a company called Nels, who were a Belgian-based postcard producer from the Edwardian period, so the pre-First World War period, and they had produced holiday postcards for the resorts on the Belgian coast, so Blankenberg and Ostend and Knokke and all these other places, and probably images of Bruges and Ghent and Brussels and everything else. And then when the kind of war came along, they produced postcards during the war that were then sold to British soldiers. And then after the war, there was a kind of explosion in interest in these kind of cards with war damage and then and now postcards and so on, and a lot of the cemetery. So Nels photographed probably about 2/3 of the cemeteries around Ypres. And I'm still finding ones that I've never seen before. So some like Tyncott, obviously had really big runs because a lot of people went there, and smaller cemeteries like Ferme-Olivier or somewhere like that had a much smaller run, and probably they're less common. But they produced a little set for Lijssenthoek, which was at a place called the Remy Siding, named after the founder Remy, the Remy farm, and the casualty clearing station was built around it. And it's a really interesting set dating from 1920, when a lot of the infrastructure of what was the casualty clearing station at Lijssenthoek was still there. So what we're looking at here is the front entrance of the casualty clearing station. So this is where the motorized ambulances would pull in from the routes from between Ypres and Popperinge, where they've come from main dressing stations or advanced dressing stations with wounded that have been brought in, had their wounds redressed, stabilized, and then selected as to whether they're going to survive the next bit of the journey, put into an ambulance, and then sent off to here. And we can see a sign that says "in" at the front there, and that's where the ambulances literally would have gone in, and then nurses and medical orderlies would have been on standby to get those wounded off the back of the ambulances and straight into these huts, which were different wards. There was operating theatres, there was X-ray facilities, blood transfusion, and so on. And there were a lot of women working here as well, certainly by 1918. So this is quite an interesting picture because there aren't that many contemporary photographs of what Lijssenthoek looked like, and this is one of those that we kind of rely on to get an idea of it. Now, of interest with the rest of the set is kind of what they do is they went round, the photographer obviously, and he took some quite interesting shots of different plots showing some unusual features. So here we can see, you know, not an untypical cemetery of the period with all these different designs of crosses. There were standard crosses, which you can see about halfway through the kind of front here, which were grave registration crosses, pre-made with metal strips on. Then there are far more elaborate ones that we can see that are painted. There are Celtic crosses. And then if you look carefully, there are 5 graves there marked by propellers. So those are all Royal Flying Corps men. You can go to this plot today. It's where the huts are in the background there. That's where the car park and the modern toilet facilities are located today. If you've been to Lijssenthoek, that's where the coaches, for example, will pull in. And the visitor centre is just off to the right of this image, down in the little dip just beneath that part of the cemetery. So you can go to this plot and you can see these RFC men in a row. Now they've got, of course, you know, standard headstone, but then they were marked out by these propeller graves, which were not unusual. I've seen them, quite a few of them, in cemeteries of the First World War. And 1 or 2 of them were brought back home. There's a little churchyard near Bolney in Sussex, where there's one in the churchyard, or there certainly used to be one in the churchyard. So a guy was shot down in the RAF in 1918, and that was the original cross that marked his grave, one of those returned crosses. And I'm pretty sure that one and quite a few of the others are on the returned website that is about these crosses that were brought home. So this gives us an insight into, really, you know, all these images do, the problem that the Imperial War Graves Commission and the British government had at the end of the First World War, that there's no uniformity here. There's some pretty elaborate graves, particularly of officers, and there are just ordinary crosses, often of ordinary men. You know, who's going to kind of maintain this? Who's going to keep it there indefinitely? And more importantly, who's going to pay for it? And that is described in previous podcasts, and many of you will have read about this as well. That's what led to the British government taking on the responsibility of the cemeteries, refusing repatriation, and then turning what we see here, a kind of myriad of different types of crosses, into a standard form of commemoration that we know today. And I'm not going to go through all the kind of postcards in the set, but there's a few interesting ones. So this is interesting because most of those graves are no longer there. This is the American plot in Lijssenthoek. So these are men of the American Expeditionary Force, principally from the 27th New York and the 30th Tennessee Old Hickory Division, who served in Flanders in August and September of 1918, and used this as a principal burial ground. They had another plot just down the road in a Bila Aerodrome Cemetery, and there were a few burials up towards the front line at Wormerzeele and at Dickerbusch and places like that. But all of those American graves, apart from a couple in this cemetery, were removed to be either buried in the Flanders Field Cemetery at Waregem, or were repatriated back to the United States. So this is a missing plot. When you go here now, it's a big expanse of open ground. There are some French graves to your left, including some from the Second World War, and then British graves begin on the kind of right of where we're standing, and then these isolated graves of Americans that remain. So it's an interesting little plot because it kind of shows it's not an insignificant number of men, but it shows that, you know, the Americans were there, and you can see very clearly on the picture 2 wooden stars of David, which is not something you'd be surprised to see for a division like the 27th recruited in New York, which had a really big Jewish community. So that's an interesting one, and I think it's one of the few images that survives of the American plot in this cemetery. Now, it's very much a multinational cemetery, Lijssenthoek, which is why it's so important and so interesting to visit. And this is the Chinese Labour Corps plot, right at the back of the cemetery alongside the French graves, you can see across to the right. and that's the buildings of the Remy farm, the Ferme de Remy, that gave the casualty clearing station and the sidings there its name, Remy Sidings. And these are men of the Chinese Labour Corps who largely died of influenza. There are some executed Chinese Labour Corps soldiers amongst them. The execution post that used to be on display in Popperinga in the back of the town hall was used for the execution of a Chinese soldier in 1919 for murder, and he's buried in this cemetery. I'm not sure if it's in this specific plot because there are some other graves, but he's certainly buried in this cemetery. And we can see it, they're not Christians, so they're using just wooden boards that are put in the ground. They've got metal tape on some of them with the details of the Chinese Labour Corps soldier, and then others have obviously been done by their comrades, and they've got proper Chinese script on it. And again, it gives us kind of fascinating insight into, a Chinese plot of a British cemetery from this period. For many years, kind of not really known. And I know I've seen kind of tentative evidence that there may be a woman buried amongst these Chinese graves, but I'm not entirely convinced about that. But anyway, maybe that's a podcast for another day, as he's often saying. But we're not going to just look at kind of images of British cemeteries. It's important to see ones of German ones. Now, I don't think in the 20s and 30s that many British visitors went to Langemarck in the same way that they do now. And I say that based on the little bit of evidence I have myself, which is photo albums from the period. They don't often include any images of Langemarck. If they do have a picture of anything German, it's a cemetery that is away from because there were a lot more German cemeteries in the 20s and 30s. It's Hugelerde Cemetery, or it's the German cemetery that was on the Menin Road, a little bit further down from Hoo Crater, for example. There was a German cemetery there until the 1950s. And because that was on a main arterial route through the battlefields, I think maybe out of curiosity they stopped. But Langemarck was not on the kind of tourist itinerary in the same way that it is today. But postcards began to be produced of it from 1933. A significant date when a certain individual, Herr Hitler, came to power in Germany, and suddenly Germans felt they could travel again in a slightly more positive way, perhaps at that point, than they did a few years later. But nevertheless, the German visitors started to come to these places, and the whole architecture of Langemarck, as we've talked about in previous podcasts and the interview with Roger Stewart and his excellent book on Langemarck, it began to change, and we kind of see this taking on a darker tone and the kind of dark threads of the 20th century beginning to run through it, because this particular postcard and the next one dates from that 1930s period, and the gate that we can see in front of us there, within 7 years of this postcard being produced, Hitler was walking through that gate, having basically trudged his way with his dirty jackboots all over Western Europe, and Europe was now under the yoke of the Nazis. But what we see here is kind of what we can see it better now, because although the flooring has changed, that's not there. The wall to the left was demolished in the 80s and then has subsequently been rebuilt. But the extended stone that wreath is hanging on was not added, and the plaque above it is Hitler's favorite quote: "Deutschland muss leben und wenn wir sterben müssen." Germany must live, and even if we must die. And that has now been moved to the other side, just above the door, kind of tucking it away almost. But it gives us an idea into the kind of architecture of this as well, and the kind of way that these postcards are photographed of the German cemeteries, and then how they're kind of printed almost, I think, is very much mirroring what is beginning to happen, and the way the Nazis want to present their world. So these are postcards. These two are both produced in Germany and were sold to German visitors to the battlefields. This is the other one I wanted to show you. German burial sites at Langemarck North, Belgium. That was its name at the time, because there was another Langemarck cemetery. But what we're seeing here is something I've talked about in the podcast, which is Nieman's Land, no man's land. So this is taken where the car park, where you park your car or your coach, is behind you today. So this is the little ditch that's there, and there's the moat, and there's the bunkers. And we can see it's a massive poppy field. I mean, it's not colour, but they certainly look like poppies to me, in full bloom, totally wild, all wild flowers. And that is exactly what was intended here, because the bunkers symbolised the three key towns in Flanders. They were original bunkers that were refaced, and they symbolised Newport, Dixmude, and Ypres. And then the blocks in between symbolised the line of the front line, and were going to be used for regimental or divisional or youth organisation memorials, some of which did get put on them, but most of them are blank. And then this was to symbolise no man's land, and then the water was the Channel coast. So it was a greatly symbolic thing. And if it kind of captures, if you want an image that captures that as it was in one shot, this is it. And the dark oaks that we know today that make that cemetery a very different atmosphere, we can see them as kind of very young trees in the background there. So it kind of shows how quickly they grow. Now, moving kind of down into the salient, this is Bard Cottage Cemetery, just north of Ypres, just west of the Easter Canal. It's a frontline cemetery used for the Bozinger and Canal sector, just north of the city. It's a cemetery particularly used by men of the 49th West Riding Division, or Yorkshire Territorial Division, that held the line there for around about a year, from 1915 through to 1916, when the Green Jackets and the Rifle Brigade, KRRs, and the Rifle Brigade, the 20th Light Division moved in. There's quite a few of their graves. It was later used 1917, particularly by the 29th Division for their attack across the Pilkelm Ridge towards Polkapel along the Steenbeck. And it's very much a comrade cemetery where you go into it and there are plots from specific battalions, from units, from divisions, and you can kind of follow that around. And this is an early Anthony of Ypres photo. So this is a real photographic image rather than a postcard. Anthony of Ypres was a photographer that had a shop in the main square of Ypres before the war. He took some really amazing photographs. Some years ago, I bought a really nice book with these pre-war images of Ypres, showing the city as it was before destruction. And then when the war was over, he returned and he set up a shop there, and he went around and photographed everything that he could and put them onto postcards, photographs. You could buy prints like this, and really big, kind of massive kind of prints as well. It's kind of a collecting sphere in its own right. They change hands for a lot of money now, Anthony of Ypres images. And for a long time, you couldn't use them in books because they held the copyright of them, wouldn't allow it. And I think the whole lot now has been transferred, rights and image archive, to the In Flanders Fields Museum in Ypres, which is good to kind of see that being done. But these original images, which are now way past copyright because they're over a century old, they still turn up. And I was lucky to kind of get a big pile of them out of Sanctuary Wood a few years ago, when the two ladies who run it cleared out the attic and found about 2,000 postcards that had been left up there for years, and they ended up being sold on their counter. So I think every battlefield guide in Christendom was kind of working their way through them, but interesting nevertheless. But these are well worth looking out for, these Anthony of Ypres images, because they're really high quality. They were done with a proper camera. And he was quite a good photographer as well, with the compositions good. But tying into that, which is kind of a kind of sub aspect of these images of cemeteries, are these things. So this is a standard document that was sent to the next of kin of soldiers who were buried in cemeteries by the Imperial War Graves Commission, the Director of Graves Registration and Inquiries. If you wrote in and asked for a picture of your son or your husband's or your brother's grave, this is what they sent you, which is a little wallet with a real photographic image tucked in it, portrait image of the grave, and then details of who it was and where the cemetery was and where the nearest railway station was, so that when you were able to, and when perhaps the war was over, because some of these were sent during the war, you could go there and make a visit. And this one is Sergeant Ernest Dean of the 1st 5th York and Lancaster Regiment. He was a coal miner from a little village called Jump, which was just across the valley from me when I lived at Elsica. In fact, from my window where I used to record the old front line, I could look across the valley and see the edge of the cemetery where the war memorial was with his name on it. and he'd grown up in the little village of Jump. He'd gone to the local colliery up at Corton Woods, and then he joined the local territorials before the war and was a sergeant on the outbreak. Went across in 1915, and he was killed during a quiet period by a sniper, which was a very common thing. They were not wearing helmets. The men were a bit careless in the front line. Sometimes they stood up on the fire steps and accidentally popped their heads over the top. You read some of these accounts that the whole German army was snipers, but I just think that they often presented unfortunate targets to the enemy, and poor old Sergeant Dean was one of them. And he was buried with many comrades from his battalion in this cemetery. And that's a kind of better view of his grave, which is a standard Graves registration unit cross with the metal strips on. And by the look of it, you see there's a second strut below. I suspect that might be the original cross that was on the grave that's been tacked to it, which may have been damaged by shell fire, because this cemetery was literally right on the front line in 1918 at the end of the Battle of Lijssenthoek that year, when the Germans pushed the Allied forces right back. So we're coming into Ypres now, and this is Ypres Reservoir Cemetery. It was at that point it was called Ypres Prison Cemetery when this photograph was taken, because the buildings in the background are part of to the left-hand side are the ruins of the prison, the city prison at Ypres, that was used by the Provost Marshal of Ypres and the town major who was in charge of it. And this is a typical wartime cemetery, well arranged. You can see they've built brick paths to access the plots. There's a whole variety of crosses in there. And it was on the Plan d'Amour, the Love's Plain, which is a big open expanse of ground on this side of the city that then was filled with British and Commonwealth dead by the end of the Great War, and then plots were expanded following the armistice. It's an interesting cemetery because there are many men buried, particularly in this plot, who were actually killed within the city itself, crossing the main square, going through the Menin gate, on the approach roads to the bridges, who were in the cathedral when it got hit by large caliber shells, or the cloth hall that got hit quite a few times by German 420s with 1-ton shells, chewing huge bits of the building out and coming down on soldiers who were working below. So it's very much an Ypres cemetery, and an interesting one. It was Rose Coombs' second favourite cemetery. Her favourite one was the Ramparts one, where her ashes are. Rose Coombs, the author of Before Endeavours Fade, and this was her second favourite cemetery, where there's a very nice photograph, a black and white picture of it taken at dusk, which is on the kind of inside front cover of the book. Whether it still is, I can't remember whether it's in the new edition, but it certainly was in the original ones. And that's a slightly different image of the same cemetery, again showing a kind of variety of crosses. What's really interesting when you kind of deep dive into these crosses is that you can see some commonality. So you see quite a lot of Celtic crosses of the same design. And when you look up those men in the register or using the kind of online Wargrave search, you discover they were from the same unit. So obviously they must have had a carpenter within that unit that made special crosses for the commemoration of that unit's dead. And I know in some Australian units, we'll come to that when we get to the Somme, those designer crosses are to an extent replicated on the design of the headstone. But the other little odd thing here, this is a Nels postcard, and you can see it's got margarine extra fine at the top on the right-hand side there. I don't know if you can see that, but these were apparently given away with packs of margarine. So you went to your, there you are, Madame Van Hoover, and you went to go and get your pack of margarine from the little grocery shop in Kemmel, and you came back with a postcard of a military cemetery tucked inside it. Hashtag who knew? But I've got a few of these now, so it was obviously not just a one-off. I've got quite a few postcards with that stamp on. So whether Nels printed too many and did a deal with the margarine people, I don't know, but it's certainly kind of a little bit of social history to the side. Now, one thing these postcards do is give us an insight, not just into the design of the cemeteries as they were, but give us images of cemeteries that no longer exist. And this is one of those. So this is Ramparts Cemetery, but not the Rampart Cemetery that we know now. This is the one that was nearer to the Menin Gate. So when you come from Ramparts and you walk back towards the Menin Gate, you come onto a long section, straight section of the bastion, and that is where this cemetery was located. All of the graves, from what I can gather, were from 1914 and 1915. By the end of the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans could pretty much look straight onto this from the Bellewaerde Ridge and the top end of the Messines Ridge and the Frasenberg Ridge and so on. So I don't think they would have been two Tommies looking at their mate's grave then, because it would have been too risky. And a book I recommended in a recent podcast, H.S. Clapham, Mud and Khaki, he talks about that because they were camped on top of the ramparts near this cemetery. And then he says it became increasingly difficult to do that because of shell fire. So this is a cemetery that was closed. The graves were moved to Aeroplane Cemetery at Portesa, which some of you may have been to. That's in a former no man's land, named after a crashed aircraft that was there. And 3 men of the Worcestershire Regiment who were executed the same day by the same execution party were once buried in here and are now buried in I think side by side in Aeroplane Cemetery. So that's part of the graves that were moved from this cemetery. And I've read, I think it was 5 executed the same day from the Worcestershire Regiment, the largest number shot on a single day during the Great War. And they were actually executed up on the top of the ramparts as well. So that was a kind of a darker chapter. But you can see how interesting and important these images are, because they give us a glimpse into a burial ground that no longer exists. And these are probably some of the very few photographs of it. And this is another example of that. Looking from the ramparts and the Menin Gate across out towards the battlefields, where there's a lot of modern houses now, and to the south there's a big youth stadium there and a running track and so on. There was a building there called the École de Bienfaisance, and it was an old Catholic school, possibly attached to either a monastery or a nunnery, I'm not sure which, and it was being used as a school at the time. And it then got turned into, because it was a fairly big building with large cellars, it was used by medical units as an advanced dressing station for a big chunk of the war. And there were 2, I think maybe even 3 burial grounds around it. And this is the only image I've ever seen of one of them. So this is the École de Bienfaisance Cemetery. And most of these men are from 1914 and 15, with a few 1916 burials. And then they seem to have stopped burying men in this particular part of the school, and then post-war the school was demolished, it was never rebuilt, and all of the graves were moved to Bedford House Cemetery just to the south of Ypres. So again, this gives us a bit of a glimpse. You can go to one of the enclosures at Bedford House, and pretty much all of the École de Bienfaisance burials are in there. And I think there's a special memorial along the edge of the wall there to some of them. And this is where they were originally buried, in this fairly small little graveyard. Now we're jumping across the border now into France, northern France. We're at Armentieres, the suburb of Armentieres, Cité Bongin, and it's quite a big cemetery in that kind of industrial side of Armentieres. This is taken just after the war. Armentieres was very badly damaged in 1918, particularly during the Battle of Lys. There were substantial civilian casualties from mustard gas when the Germans hit it with mustard gas, and the buildings are very badly damaged. But you can see the factories are already beginning to be rebuilt. They prioritise the reconstruction of those in the early 20s. And I would guess this image dates from around about 1921, just before the main work on the construction of the cemetery began. And it's an important cemetery in many ways. It's the largest, one of its reasons why it's important, it's the largest number of New Zealanders buried in one cemetery on the Western Front. So that's this one. And they're not men killed in great battles. They're men killed in the early experiences of the New Zealand Division Expeditionary Force when it came across to France after Gallipoli and after its service in Egypt in early 1916. And although they did bury, they had the front line up at Bois Grenier and in that kind of sector towards Fromelles. Although they did bury men in the front line there, if you go to Rue Petillon, for example, you'll find some graves there. But this seems to have been used as a main burial ground for them. So if you ever kind of do any work following the New Zealanders around the Western Front, this is a cemetery that's really important to go to. And there is one of their battle memorials to the missing in here as well, that commemorates the men from that sector who have no known grave. And this is probably only a couple of years later, and we can see the cemetery transformed from an area of wooden crosses into the kind of cemetery that we know today. Despite its size and despite its importance, I don't think it's one of the most visited cemeteries on the Western Front, which is a great shame, because it's got very few unknown burials. So it's got a very high proportion of known soldiers. So we can look at units, we can look at men, we can discover stories. And it's, you know, one of the kind of fascinations, I think, of the silent cities is that you can get so much information out just by kind of wandering around the rows of graves and seeing some kind of commonality there. Now we're going a little bit further south. It's not strictly a cemetery, this one, but it's near to the Indian Corps Memorial. So we're at New Chapelle now on the La Bombe crossroads, which is just to the left of this image. And the Indian Corps Memorial is just to the left of this. This memorial still exists. It's at the back of the Indian Corps Memorial now. But at this time, before the Second World War, it was on its own site, surrounded by railings. You can see with a little bridge across the ditch to get to it. And it remembers an officer, Lieutenant Crichton of the 3rd Battalion, a London regiment, who was killed in the Battle of New Chapelle and had no known grave. His name was added to the Le Touré Memorial, and the family decided to build this mini cenotaph to him here. And following the construction of it, his body was found in the fields directly opposite some years later. And so he's now buried in a cemetery just down the road. The monument was hit by, well, the whole crossroads was hit by Stuka dive bombers in May 1940. This is one of those places where World War I meets World War II. And the memorial was very badly damaged, repaired, and then subsequently moved when the ownership of the ground changed. I think in the 1950s, the commission moved it to the rear of the Indian Corps Memorial because the family had invested money so that the commission maintained it on their behalf. So it wasn't one of these private memorials that was just kind of put up and no one thought about what would happen when mum and dad eventually passed away. But it just shows, it's a shame that there's quite a few private memorials, and they are kind of things that I always kind of search for postcard wise, but unless they were in really prominent places, it's very rare to find this kind of image of them, because I don't think there were many people going to the battlefields in the 20s that would have bought a postcard of this. But this was bundled into a little pack of postcards of the First War sites around New Chapelle, which is kind of probably why it ended up being photographed. But nevertheless, for us, very kind of fascinating insight into what one of these private memorials originally looked like. Now, when it came to kind of special events, people cashed in on this. And so one postcard company that was based near Arras for the, I know some of you here took part in GP90, the 90th anniversary of the Great Pilgrimage, which was in August 1928. They produced several versions of postcard booklets with the British Legion mentioned on the front of it, and the fact that it was stuff that they were selling to the pilgrimage, because, you know, quite a few thousand British Legion members went over, and somebody saw a business opportunity to flog them some postcards, and they put them into these booklets, and that's the kind of cover for it. Then they're not uncommon. I mean, I guess probably a lot of people on it bought them, but they've got some really interesting cemeteries within them, and I'm not going to show you all of them, but this is one of the ones that's in that particular booklet that ties nicely with a recent podcast episode where we looked at Gavrelle near Arras and the Royal Marines, for example, and the Royal Naval Division casualties there in April 1917. There are Naval Trench Cemetery that's there is a later cemetery from when the line went static, but the ones that were killed in the fighting there, the ones that have identified or are unknown Royal Naval Divisions, are largely buried in here, which is Orchard Dump Cemetery, just to the north of northeast of that area, just beyond Oppie. Again, a very large, very important cemetery, but one I would guess rarely visited, despite the fact that it sits in the shadow of Vimy Ridge. When you stand there and you look across to your left, you can see the dominance of Vimy Ridge in the background. And it was the first cemetery for me. Back in the 1980s, I went up to Maidenhead to the headquarters of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission when there was no visitor centre, the archives weren't open, and you had to kind of twist a few arms and legs and everything else to try and get in there. And this is where I saw my first set of cemetery records, burial records, showing what kind of information was put against each burial. And it was fascinating to see. It was this cemetery because I was looking at a guy who was a Hull pal who was buried in here. His body was found in the 1930s. And it was interesting to see with a lot of these unknowns that you can see that there's very few identified soldiers, even just by looking at the front of this picture, that the amount of information was really kind of fascinating, that they would find a body and it would have a set of webbing gear where it'd say Private J.A.S question mark IT question mark, and then a number 1234 question mark Sussex Regiment, and then they couldn't trace these blokes. But now with databases and stuff like that, probably we could identify a lot of these guys, which is kind of what we're beginning to see as people are looking at these records, which are now online and starting to do research, and headstones are being rededicated. There was one rededicated at Regina Trench Cemetery near Courcelette just a few weeks ago that my daughter Poppy went to. So it's an ongoing thing. As we often say, the last page of the history is never turned. Now, this is an image. This is another kind of postcard image of the period, one taken by a veteran. So this is a photograph taken by a veteran for a reason, sadly, I'll never know, but it's AIF burial ground at Flers. And it gives the other kind of fascinating thing about these pictures is they show us what the horticulture of the cemeteries were like in that interwar period, and also the condition of the headstones, which is not dissimilar to the condition of the headstones now in terms of the fact they look dirty because they didn't use chemicals in those days. They were not chemically clean. That had not been invented, I suspect, but the commission used kind of the natural approach to maintenance, and a lot of the headstones in the interwar period, even 10 years after they were up, were dark and dirty and grubby looking, which was considered okay at the time. Now, I'm not going to kind of prompt an argument to say that it's okay now, but there's certainly lots of vocal people on social media discussing this, but we have to kind of look for an historical precedence. And the photographs show us that the condition of the headstones then were not dissimilar to the condition of headstones now. And also, I think that the planting of this cemetery greatly reflects what is done there now. I mean, it's a stunning cemetery, AIF burial ground near Flers. And it's kind of gone full circle. When I first went here in the 80s, it was not as much plantation as there is on this picture, and not as much as there is now. Commission had a different view then, but they've come full circle and they've returned to this kind of density of bushes and flowers and small trees and so on. And it's hard to see, but the other thing that interests me on this picture, we can see a ridge line in the background, and it looks as if it's part of this bush on the right. But there is a tree on that ridge line, which almost certainly is on the grave of Colonel Feversham, the Earl of Feversham, who was the commander of 21st KRRs and was buried in an isolated grave there in the interwar period until it was moved, I think, in the 50s into this cemetery. We did an episode called The Colonel's Field, which is about that grave, which you can go back to if you've not had a chance to listen to that. So the other thing is we've got memorials as well as cemeteries, and that shows us the kind of changing landscape. So these are a couple of aerial images from, I think, just after the Second World War, or possibly just before, but more likely just after the Second World War. So this is Thiepval, showing a slightly different kind of layout to what we know today. So you came in to the circular driveway. There was a proper wall, all round aspects of it. We can see that the trees that are about to be cut down sometime in the next year or so that surround the monument today were deliberately planted, and I hope they'll go back and do kind of similar thing. That the back of the Anglo-French cemetery was hedged off. The cross was kind of part of the hedge, so there's no view down the ridge towards Thiepval Wood. But the interesting thing, when you kind of, probably your screens don't do justice for it, but I don't know if I can zoom in and possibly a little bit. Let's have a look. There's a little bit there. You can see all the white marks in the fields there, which are the traces of the trenches. Round the farm there, which is opposite the church, there's a huge amount of very interesting looking mounds and stroke excavations which look to me to be kind of battlefield related. And we can see that there is a lot of trees, a lot more trees on the slope here. This is what on this bit, going down towards Thiepval Wood. This is all part of the old Chateau Park that regrew. And when I went there in the early 80s, that had gone, but there was a sunken lane that came from the road that goes from Thiepval to the Ulster Tower. That was the jumping off point of the Salford Pals on the 1st of July. And that was there until the late 80s when it was grubbed out, but it's very, very visible on here. So again, these pictures are really, really important for understanding the landscape, seeing the changes in it. And the big white building we can see to the right of the Thiepval Memorial is the building that was purposefully built as a cafe and has now returned to being a cafe. For a long while, it was the house of the mayor of Thiepval, but it's now returned to being a cafe once more. But that closed sometime in the 70s because so few people came here and there was no trade coming into Thiepval. And you can see how few houses there are at Thiepval as well. Now, this is from the same company, Cine, who went around and photographed a huge amount of stuff from the air. You can see the shadow of their aircraft across the graves in this image as well. And this is showing the post, I'm pretty sure this one is post-Second World War, because this is the period where they began to do some work on the memorial to repair it. It had the same kind of problems it has had recently with exposure and the brickwork. And also, if you look at the back of it, there is no steps coming down into the cemetery. That was not part of the original monument. That was done in the post-Second World War period. And I think that's what they're beginning to do with the work that we see going on around the memorial. So these images, as well as being kind of tourist postcards, actually are really important documents that kind of inform us about the history of these sites. Now we're going across the River Somme now to Villers-Bretonneux, and we're actually at Adelaide Cemetery at Villers-Bret. And this is very much an Australian cemetery. These are pretty much all Australian graves in here. And this is the final plot right at the back of the cemetery today. A couple of rows down is where the body of an unknown soldier, of an Australian unknown soldier, was exhumed in the 1990s to be taken back to Canberra, to the Australian War Memorial, where there's a unique grave to him there now. And we can see the different designs. And I mentioned that the Australian graves normally have the AIF rising cap badge in a circle at the top. But there are some AIF graves where they have it in the middle of a large cross on the headstone. And they're pretty much all men that had, if you can find images like this and you find a grave with a Celtic cross on it, that seems to have been perpetuated on the headstone, bizarrely. So I'm sure there cannot have been a commission directive on that, but it does seem to be not an uncommon thing. But again, a kind of fascinating insight into a kind of smaller battlefield cemetery on the Somme. We're coming behind the lines now. Journey's almost over. And this is Etaples. This is Etaples Cemetery at the end of the war on a snowy day in 1918. We can see the bay alongside the other side of the railway in the background, the vastness of the cemetery, some of the hospital buildings and camp buildings in the foreground here. The hospital completely surrounded the cemetery. And when you read about it, there's some fascinating accounts of life here written by doctors and nurses. At one stage, in the early period of the war, they would play the last post every time a soldier was buried in here. And they were burying them like 20, 30 a day. So the last post was being played that many times. And it was upsetting the patients who were in the wards that surrounded it, because they knew if someone was playing the last post, somebody else had died, and was it going to be them next? So they stopped doing that. They still had obviously funerals, but they didn't play the last post every 5 minutes. And I think it gives you, today it's difficult to go there with the trees to see without a drone or, to kind of get a real kind of sense of the vastness of this cemetery, which is almost 10,000 burials, the second largest British and Commonwealth cemetery in France, St. Saviour being the largest. It's, I think you can get the kind of scale of it. And this next one is then taken, these are all taken by a British photographer who went there and photographed the whole camp, which I managed to get a set of the images that he took some years ago. And this is taken at kind of ground level, if you like, showing what, the plots. And this is towards the back of the cemetery. You can see the embankment of the railway line there. and this is an area where you've got where they're standing is very close to where Corporal Wood is buried, and he was the Gordon Highlander who was shot accidentally by a military policeman that led to the whole riot at Etaples in September 1917. But again, it kind of shows that a lot of the graves are marked with planks rather than crosses, which is an interesting thing. And they aren't Chinese Labour Corps. I don't think that plot's got Germans in it, but it's an interesting kind of aside to it, all part of the history of these things. And then we'll end with a familiar place, because, you know, when we kind of, if you start, and I, you know, as always, like recommending books, I would say be careful if you start collecting cemetery postcards because it's going to cost you a lot of money with some of them, and it will keep you busy. But there are some things that are more common than others. The Menin Gate, being what it was, is highly photographed. There are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of different postcard images of it. But I'm always tempted to buy any photographs I ever find of it, because I think they all add something. And this is one of the summer dusk last posts sometime in the late 20s or 30s, probably around about 1930, by the clothing and by the state of the tower of the cloth hall in the distance there. I just think there's something fascinating. There's something eternally fascinating by looking at these images of the Menin Gate. It stands for just about everything that inspires, I think, all of us to travel across the old front line. And, you know, we're seeing a period of change there now, where this is in scaffolding and covered in sheeting, and like a phoenix, it will, like the city of Ypres is a phoenix, the Menin Gate will rise in time for the centenary. And these images are all part of its history, all part of its past, and all part of those crisscross pathways of the Great War. So there we are, a few little images that I hope you found of interest. Okay, now I'll just come out of this.